Hello, folks. We're looking at documents related to human origins today. I'm going to highlight several important observations about several of these documents in this presentation. You may or may not be able to make annotations on your document. I would recommend having a piece of paper available to make documentations. We already read this first document, the first page and a half of this document, and discovered that this piece of Hebrew scripture portrays two different accounts of human origins. The first account focusing generally on the idea of creation by a God who simply spoke creation into existence, ex nihilo. Then we looked at the second account, which focuses on humankind in chapter 2. And that brings us to the interesting and very important historically chapter 3, which we'll look at in a little bit. We're going to come back to that, though. I'd like to skip down and look at this page here. Let me rotate it back. Okay. So this is a piece by Howard Gardner, who's was a professor at Harvard. He discusses Darwin's life, and there's a video that I'd like you to watch today that goes into a little detail about Darwin's journey on the ship Beagle. Beagle was a British ship that he joined as a naturalist. Darwin came from a wealthy family that was well known in parts of England. He didn't have to worry about money, so he could go on this long journey collecting specimens and making observations without any kind of concern about how he would maintain himself. Many of the scientists of the mid-1800s were from wealthy families and did what they called natural history, engaging in observations of the natural world and writing about those observations. So as you look at the video, I'd like you to remember this piece here that describes his life and his discoveries. The Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, off the coast of Peru. These islands are a small group of islands. An archipelago is a group of islands. You can go visit them today. And what he found were birds that, what he discovered later when he went back to England, were the same species, but had a little bit different physical characteristics one from another. And that prompted him to think, how can I explain this? And that's what prompted him to come up with this idea of natural selection. So natural selection is so the Galapagos Islands here. Good. So natural selection is described in this right-hand side here. Let me see if I can do this for you. Okay. And so these 3 paragraphs in plain English describe Darwin's theory of natural selection. The next document, and I'm going to have to flip this again, okay, is from his book, Origin of Species. Now, if you look at the center paragraph, the center column, and you read each of these sentences, you'll discover that some of these sentences are really long sentences. Darwin's ideas are very logical. They string together very logically. He writes in a manner that's puts these ideas together, often a whole string of ideas in one sentence, or a whole string of support for a single idea in one sentence. But I'd like to draw your attention to several parts of this. In the center column, I'd like you to find the second paragraph, where it begins with the word authors. Authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. In other words, there is no development of new species from the species that are already created. Now, I want you to notice this next statement. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that the production and extinction of past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes. So this whole section here, let me see if I can mark this for you. Okay, so this whole section here gives a background to Darwin's perspective. He is not saying that there is no God. He is saying that there is a creator with a capital C, but this creator has made the world such that species develop, and they develop sometimes from each other, not each thing created individually. Now, that's his worldview, and there are other worldviews about human creation, but it's important to understand that Darwin was not an atheist here. He was not rejecting God. He was saying, this is how I think the Creator works. And if you, the rest of this goes into more detail about that, but skip over to the right-hand column. This first sentence is a long sentence, but I want you to kind of picture yourself the riverbank beside Bart's as you think about this. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank like a riverbank or a hillside, clothed with plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent upon each other in a complex manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. So what Darwin is saying, he's saying that in this world, there are certain laws that govern life. And those laws indicate that there is growth in the next sentence, reproduction, inheritance, variability, increase, natural selection, divergence of character, and extinction of less improved forms. So he's saying that this is the natural way about things. There is a creator, but these laws that the creator has put into place indicate that beings have developed. Now, I want you to notice this last sentence. Again, another long sentence here. Darwin says there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having originally been breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So Darwin is looking at this as an amazing thing. He's saying these laws are amazing. These laws that allow species to come into existence are amazing, and they have been started by a creator. So Darwin is not denying God. He's just saying, this is how I think it happened. Okay, that brings us to the next to the last. Okay, one, Kenneth Miller, Finding Darwin's God. Now, Miller is a biologist, a chemical biologist out at Brown University. I think he's retired now. But these paragraphs here are his scientific and perspective based on his worldview on evolution and the idea of a God. And you may say, well, why in history we're talking so much about God and these things? Well, it's important to understand a person's worldview. And when we talk about human origins, when we talk about human history, we talk about purpose in humanity. Often one of the most fundamental questions comes back to a spiritual question. Now, as historians, we need to understand what that is in order to understand people's behavior. Now, I'm not asking you here to believe in God or not believe in God, but we're trying to understand people's behavior and why people think the way they do. So Miller here starts out by saying, if he so choose, the God whose presence is taught by most Western religions, he's thinking Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, could have fashioned anything, ourselves included, ex nihilo, from his wish alone. Now we already know what ex nihilo means from nothing. Okay. And then he goes on to say, in our childhood as a species, this might have been the only way we could imagine the fulfillment of his will. But we've grown up and something remarkable has happened. We have begun to understand the physical basis of life itself. If the persistence of life were beyond the capabilities of matter, if a string of constant miracles were needed for each turn of the cell cycle or each flicker of the cilium, the hand of God would be written directly into every living thing. His presence at the edge of the human sandbox would be unmistakable. Such findings might confirm our faith, but they would undermine our independence. How could we fairly choose between God and man when the presence and power of the divine is so obviously and so literally controlled our every breath? Our freedom as his creatures requires a little space, some integrity, and consistency and self-sufficiency to the material world. So what he's saying here is that if there is a God and that God could create everything, if that God determined every little thing that happens, then we wouldn't have much freedom. Now let's think about that. I'd like you to write down the word choice. My suggestion is that human choice is one of the things that makes us human, that marks us as humans, as distinct from other creatures. There are very few creatures that are going to choose to do something that is risky to their lives in order to save another creature, even one of their own. Now, there are some that will do that in circumstances, but as a rule, only humankind does that. That's a choice. Why do firemen go into burning buildings? You might say, well, they're trained, they know how to do it safely. Yes, they're trained, they know how to keep themselves as safe as possible, but it's still deadly. It's deadly dangerous. And they're making a choice to do that because they are putting their lives on the line for another person. So human choice requires freedom, the freedom to make that choice. We're not bound only by the chemicals in our brain. We can make a choice that is kind of illogical in some ways. Why would you go in a burning building, especially for someone you don't even know? So let's look at this more. He says, accepting evolution is neither more or less than the result of respecting the reality and consistency of the physical world over time. We are material beings with an independent physical existence, and to fashion any such beings, any creator would have had to produce what? Would have had to produce an independent material universe in which evolution over time was a contingent possibility. A believer in the divine accepts that God's love and his gifts of freedom are genuine. So genuine that they include the power to choose evil and, if we wish, to freely send ourselves to hell. So in other words, we have choice. When we look around the world and we see that we have choice, and that choice gives us the opportunity to choose good or evil. You can choose to be loving. Now think about this. If you don't have choice, can you love if you don't have choice? Let me move that down here. Can you love if you don't have choice? No, you can't. Love is a choice. So without human choice, we don't have love, we don't have hate, we don't have freedom. And Miller is saying, without human choice, we do have, if we have human choice, then we have evolution. Now, you may say, well, there's some logical steps there he's missed out. Well, read the book. He goes through the logic of his argument here. But he goes on to say here, I'd like you to keep on reading. Not all believers will accept the stark conditions of that bargain, but our freedom to act has to have a physical and biological basis. Evolution and its sister sciences of genetics and molecular biology provide that basis. Biologically static world will leave a creator's creatures with neither the freedom nor the independence required to exercise that freedom. In biological terms, remember, he's a biologist, evolution is the only way a creator could make us the creatures we are, free beings in a world of authentic and meaningful moral and spiritual choices. So now this is his perspective based on his worldview and his profession. Those who ask from science are a final argument, an ultimate proof, an unassailable position from which the issue of God may be decided will always be disappointed. As a scientist, I claim no new proofs, no revolutionary data, no stunning insight into nature that can tip the balance in one direction or another. But I do claim that to a believer, even in the most traditional sense, evolutionary biology is not at all the obstacle we often believe it to be. In many respects, evolution is the key to understanding our relationship with God. God's physical intervention in our lives is not direct, but his care and constance and the strength he gives, while the stuff of miracle is a miracle of hope, faith, and inspiration. So Miller is saying, again, his point of view as a scientist, as an evolutionary biologist, he's saying, this helps me understand my human character and understand God. I can't give you evidence for that, but it helps me understand. It puts together the pieces of my worldview. Finally, the last source. The last source is different from all the others, very different. The author is a man, and you should write this down somewhere, didn't come out clearly. A man named Vine Deloria, L-O-R. Wow, that's really hard to see. Vine Deloria passed away a few years ago. He's a Native American teacher and thinker, philosopher. He's written extensively. You can pick up his books. This was a book called Evolution, Creationism, and Other Myths. And here he basically says that creationism, the idea that God created the earth in 7 24-hour days. There are other varieties of that idea, but that's the one he focuses on. He says that's wrong. He also says that Darwin is wrong. Evolutionism is wrong. What he says is on the right-hand column here. When the smoke clears and we make all the proper adjustments in our thinking, we will come to understand that quite possibly we are not the first humanoid species to live on the earth. That there is a rough repeating pattern in the Earth's history where this planet is being transformed and new biospheres come into existence through the processes of which we are not yet dreamed. This worldview is found in the traditions of non-Western peoples, including many tribal peoples. Such beliefs, which we may have only previously rejected as childish superstitions, may turn out to be our only glimpse of the real planetary past. So he's saying, you're all wrong. He's saying there have been cycles of creation and destruction, and that's the explanation. And it doesn't have to do with a God creating or evolution. It's not that at all. We are in the midst of a cycle, and we can only see that cycle, and we can imagine that there are others, but we really don't know, except that we know that there's cycles of creation and destruction, life and death, new kinds of life. So this is an entirely different worldview. All right, so I leave you with these comments on these sources and ask you to complete the questions that I've provided for you on those sources, on these sources. These sources offer insight into at least 4 different worldviews and at least 4 different ways of thinking about human origins. I hope this has been helpful as you've tried to think about a worldview and as you begin to think about how other people in other times and places and other people around us today have differences in perspective on the world.